I always keep my eye on Bungie games because I'm the perfect age demographic where Halo 1, 2, and 3 was my high school career and responsible for a downturn in my high school GPA because Xbox Live was awesome. We were all going to be pro Halo players, etc. You don't need my life story, though. The Destiny live service stuff kind of left me behind. I've had my eye on Marathon. I'm also not that into extraction shooters, though. This game's going to be up against Arc Raiders, which is exploding, so I'll be interested to see how this plays out. And we'll test it out on the channel once we get the open preview, which is promised before the actual game releases. The game release date is March 5th, and there will be an open preview weekend before launch. I've heard some people saying this the weekend before launch, but I would interpret this as some weekend before the launch. So at least we'll be able to test it out then. But for now, what we have is the PC system requirement chart. Now, I have mixed feelings about this. Number one, I love how low the minimum requirements are. And I think that that's backed up by the art style, because if we look at the art style, this seems to continue in the Bungie tradition of nice looking games that are not shooting for photorealism. And that art style allows them to look good while not being super demanding performance wise. So I would say from that aspect, this looks pretty promising. And again, these system requirements seem to back that up, but I have some major issues with these system requirements. The first issue is these are definitely the old style that do not tell you any resolution, graphic setting, or frame rate target, or whether upscaling is being used, anything really. So that's a huge downside. It's just like, you need at least this to play, and then this is what we recommend. What sort of performance will you get on that? Who the heck knows? I could speculate, and I will, because why not? But also, when you're just trying to look at, so what do I need as a minimum to play the game? Here's where I really have an issue with this. The 3 graphics cards that they list are absolute worlds apart in their usual performance on average in a variety of games. So the 1050 Ti is a very old and weak graphics card. Apologies if you have one. And I actually think that that's a good thing if the game can run to some minimal satisfactory level of performance on this card. This is a 4GB graphics card from ages ago. This launched on October 25th of 2016, so we're going on just about 10 years old, maybe a little bit less. So it's a decade-old graphics card from the 50 class, although it's a 50 Ti. So this was a lower end card a decade ago, so it's admirable that they're claiming the game is going to perform well on this. Well, maybe not well, but at least to a minimum level of satisfaction. It launched at $139 10 years ago. So that's pretty cool. But here's where I have the issues. Notice that they're pairing it with an RX 5500 XT. Now, they're both 4GB graphics cards, so maybe that has something to do with it, but it really doesn't make sense because there's other AMD graphics cards that I think would meet a more similar level of performance to the 1050 Ti. And don't tell me that it's like a ray tracing difference or something like that, because the 1050 Ti is also not doing, we're not talking RTX cards here, guys. This was before NVIDIA launched into their whole ray tracing and machine learning upscalers and all of that. 1050 Ti is not doing your ray tracing or your DLSS or anything like that. So as we scroll up here, you can see that cards like a 1650 are above what they're saying is the minimum NVIDIA GPU here, but also so would be like a Radeon RX 570. A Radeon RX 570 is above the specs that they're listing as the minimum requirement. It also has 4GB of VRAM, so it seems to be meeting all of the requirements that they're mentioning here. It's actually a newer graphics card than the 1050 Ti, launching a couple years later and at a slightly higher price, and it is more powerful on average than the 1050 Ti. Now, it's important to note that what I'm using here is Tech PowerUp's relative performance chart, which gives you a ballpark figure, which isn't going to line up to particular games, right? So in some games, AMD or NVIDIA or a particular line or architecture will outperform compared to average. But we're talking that the RX 570 on average is over 40% more powerful than the 1050 Ti, and yet we're still not up to the minimum AMD graphics card that they're listing here, which is a 5500 XT. So let's keep scrolling up, guys. So now we're getting cards like the GTX 970, so good news, that's almost 50% more powerful than the minimum requirement, even if you're still on a GTX 970. But again, here we have the RX 480 from AMD, which seems like it's well, quite a bit above the 1050 Ti, but no, we're still not up to what they're listing here. They're listing the 5500 XT, which in general is averaging 65% more powerful than the 1050 Ti. If I pull this 5500 XT up, again, 4GB graphics card, so it seems to have the amount of VRAM that they're wanting here. But this launched in 2019, so we're talking about a significantly newer graphics card, newer architecture that is generally significantly more powerful in a wide variety of games than this minimum 1050 Ti GPU, which is starting to make this list hard to actually use to tell people whether you're at like the minimum or the recommended. And the Intel GPUs get even more confusing because they're mentioning an Intel Arc A580, which is an 8GB card. So clearly they're saying 4GB is fine. So they're just listing that the A580 has 8GB. And it's also encouraging that they're mentioning that it has to have rebar enabled because it is important with Intel Arc GPUs. If you don't have resizable bar on your system, they just don't work correctly. They're just unsupported on systems without resizable bar. So that's encouraging. That tells me that they're paying some amount of attention to their PC system requirements. That's a good thing. But the A580 relative performance-wise, we're still going to have to keep climbing, guys. So if we keep climbing through this system requirements chart, we're now up to cards like the 1650 Super, which is 69% faster than the 1050 Ti, and pretty nice. 1660, RTX 3050. We're getting all the way up to a GTX 1070, a 1070 Ti, RTX 2060, and now more powerful than that is the Arc A580 on average. But notice something. The Arc A580, at least in this relative performance chart, is slightly faster than a RTX 2060. Also, I'll notice a bit of a typo here. The recommended GPU is a GTX 2060. Now, I'm imagining there was some amount of copy and pasting maybe going on when they created this, but again, it's a lack of attention to detail on the PC system requirements, which I don't like. It's not an encouraging sign. Where it was nice that they noticed that and even bothered to list that Intel Arc cards require resizable bar, they didn't notice that this is when NVIDIA moved from the GTX line to the RTX line. So that's a little bit, discouraging as far as the attention that they're putting on this system requirements chart. Also note, like I said, that the A580 is sometimes as powerful or more powerful than the 2060. And yet the 2060 is the recommended GPU, and the Arc A580 is listed alongside the 1050 Ti as a minimum requirement. This really doesn't make a lot of sense for somebody who's trying to determine what class of GPU I need to play this game. Are they saying that this game is super unoptimized for Intel GPUs? Or are they saying that maybe these are just the minimum GPUs from each brand that they bothered to test and confirm that they work? But then they tested these and said it works smoother. And since they're not making any particular performance claim, maybe they're not saying that these achieve the same level of performance in the game. But you guys see that this is a confusing way to list these things for the end user. Because generally, they list a couple of GPUs, and then it's on you, the user, to read the system requirements chart and figure out how your hardware, which probably isn't the specific GPUs that they listed, how it stacks up against what they are listing. And it's really hard to do that when they list things that don't have the same performance in the same column, or list things that do have similar performance in different columns. It's really unwieldy for the end user and makes the system requirement chart effectively useless. Now, that being said, I'm already making a video about it, so let's keep talking. So I'm now going to set the RTX 2060, which is a 6GB card launched in 2019, so going on over 6 years old now, going on 7. It was a $349 MSRP when it launched. I'm going to set that as the baseline now on the relative performance chart. Now, again, this is where we can look at how these things stack up. So the RX 5700 XT is at least, okay, we're within 18%. So we're not talking worlds apart in the same way that the 1050 Ti and the 5500 XT were. So these at least somewhat make sense to put in a relatively similar performance class. And honestly, on a game-by-game basis, sometimes your AMD versus your NVIDIA architectures can perform differently. So these being in the same class, that's at least somewhat reasonable to me. But again, the Arc A580, which is kind of splitting the difference here, is put in the minimum one, which really feels weird. Now here they put the Arc A770. Now the Arc A770 is only a little bit more powerful than the 5700 XT, and it is more powerful than the 2060. We're not talking like double the performance or anything. It's like maybe 30% on average. And again, in certain engines, certain games, the Intel Arc GPUs kind of underperform. So it's not unusual to see them all over the place in terms of how they perform in specific titles. But overall, this really ends up being, I think, somewhat useless for people because in addition to this, the choice of putting the Arc A580 and 5500 XT in the same class as a 1050 Ti, in addition to that, they're not giving us any performance targets here anyway. So I could speculate that this being a multiplayer shooter, I would imagine that even the minimums are probably around 60 FPS. And given that it's minimum, I would say that at least on the 1050 Ti, you're probably talking the lowest possible graphics settings. And are we talking 1080p or 1080p with upscaling, 720p native? It doesn't tell us. And considering the wide performance difference between these GPUs, maybe it's like low settings 720p on the 1050 Ti, but like low settings 1080p on the 5500 XT and low settings 1440p on the A580 because Intel cards generally scale up to higher resolutions more gracefully than the other ones do. I mean, it's really bizarre that these are listed together. But again, it is encouraging that they're at least saying the game should be playable on a card as old and low end as a 1050 Ti. Again, no offense if you have a 1050 Ti or equivalent card. There's games that run perfectly well on it, and this apparently may be one of them. Now, the last things I want to mention is it's also nice to see that the minimum RAM required to run the game, not VRAM, but just system RAM, is only 8 gigabytes. That's nice to see, although to play at higher settings, the recommendation would be 16 gigabytes of RAM. And then the CPUs for minimum are i5 6600 or Ryzen 5 2600, and the recommended i5 10400 or Ryzen 5 3500. So I would imagine that these recommended ones are probably going to be well over 60 FPS, and these minimum ones are probably closer to that 60 FPS line. But again, I'm just speculating because they're not telling us. I hope that they give us a better systems requirement chart once the game actually launches. But, we will have the playtest weekend. So that'll be a really good time to find out how your system runs it. And I'll probably produce some videos on the channel when that happens, testing out a variety of hardware to see how things go. Anyway, that's what I've got for you guys today. I wish these were more informative and less crazily paired up here, especially on the minimum side of things. But that's what we've got. Are you guys interested in Marathon or not? Let me know in the comment section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.